Good morning, everybody. I mean, it's morning for me in India, but good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for making it to the presentation today. I really appreciate your presence. And during the course of the next 25 minutes or 30 minutes, I'll be talking about why we need to make healthy environments a parenting agenda. And that's based off the work that I've done in India so far as a part of my doctoral thesis. And as Alina mentioned, I'm a current, almost past, almost done doctoral candidate. And there are two things that I wanted to mention right before I start. So I very ambitiously said that I also wanted in the abstract that I also wanted to talk about my experience of doing research in a transdisciplinary project and of being a woman from global south doing research that is funded by global north in global south, the whole gamut of experiences there. But unfortunately, I don't think so I'll be able to cover that today, but I'm happy to have a chat with anybody who's interested in hearing about that. And with that, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which the UQ University campuses are located and pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. And continuing in the same spirit of acknowledgement, right about the time that I started my PhD, my mother had just been certified as a jump circle facilitator, which basically meant that she kind of could facilitate a group in playing djembes. And because djembe is a West African percussion instrument, a lot of the philosophy was guided by the beautiful continent. And one of the things that I read at the start was that if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go with somebody. And nowhere have I found it more applicable than in my own PhD process. Oftentimes I'll be using I instead of we, but this really is the sum total of so many people's efforts, and I'm really thankful to each one of them who's been a part of it. So with that, I would kind of like to move on to the next slide. So the first slide is almost like preaching to the converted, because I know that everybody who's a part of the presentation today it cares deeply about child health and well-being. But just if we wanted to get a lay of the land before we kind of delve deeper into my doctoral thesis, there's a bit of not a bit, but a massive moral imperative associated with wanting to help children survive, and once they survive, helping them to thrive as they grow up. But often that desired goal is disrupted by three major things. One is mortality, in terms of children either dying at birth or within the first 5 years or before they have attained adulthood for causes that are way beyond their control, for issues related to morbidity in terms of illnesses that kind of strike kids when they're young, and also adverse childhood experiences that may disrupt the normal trajectory of their growth. Now, one would like to believe that these causes and these these factors are kind of prevalent all over the world, which they are. But one of the things that we've also seen is that in conditions of impoverishment, and when I talk about impoverishment here, I'm speaking specifically from the point of view of economic impoverishment. In conditions of impoverishment, there are these issues seem to be found more. But at the same time, I'd like to kind of clarify that the word impoverishment, even when we're using it in terms of economic impoverishment, in a way kind of obscures the actual causes, because there are a lot of things that are associated with poverty. So one can't really attribute it to just poverty per se, but a host of conditions that in a way coexist with poverty. But despite all of these issues, there's been a major thrust to promote child health and well-being based on the concept of triple dividend, which basically means that if we invest in child health and well-being when the child is young, not only are we making the life of the child better in their current circumstances, but also helping children to kind of helping children when they grow up as adults, because all of these problems don't really kind of there's a sequelae associated with most of these problems. For adverse childhood experience, there's just an enormous amount of literature how the effects kind of persist well into adulthood as such. So if we don't kind of tackle it at the right time, it's not just the child in the as a child, but also as an adult and as a future parent, where they begin to suffer the effects of these issues. And talking about the child as a future parent, parenting interventions have been found to be extremely effective in addressing all of these all of these factors, all of these risk factors as such. But despite the fact that they're extremely effective and they have a wide evidence base, when these parenting interventions are transported from high income countries where they're usually developed to low and middle income countries in different parts of the world, there have been questions about the ecological validity of these interventions as to say whether they're really culturally and contextually relevant or not. And the other thing is also related to the skill-based development that is done for parents, as in parents may acquire skills that they need to become better parents, but does the environment around them change or not? And that's important because if we kind of unpack parenting interventions from an ecological perspective, one of the things that we need to understand is that parent-child interaction is one of the most critical processes. If done right, it leads to competence in children. And if it's not done so right, it leads to conditions of dysfunction. And though we're kind of coming at it from the parenting perspective, it's a bidirectional process. It's the children affect parents and parents affect children. And it's not just that there's a bidirectional interaction here. It's also kind of impacted by the context in which the child is growing up, because oftentimes when we kind of implement an intervention without kind of contextualizing it or without adapting it, we make the error of thinking that parenting is a decontextualized act, which, I mean, intuitively we would understand it really isn't. And even if we kind of adapt interventions, oftentimes what happens is that there's a skewed focus on the social environment or the milieu in which the child is growing, and not so much on the physical environment in which the child is growing. So to kind of address this concern, and also kind of to in a way broaden our understanding of the impact of impoverished physical environment on children, parents, and the way the children are raised, we conducted our first stakeholder study in the first year of my PhD. And because I'm going to be using the phrase impoverished physical environment several times over, I just wanted to operationalize it for all of us. So impoverished physical environment is any condition of deficit or deprivation that is created in the environment, as in circumstances that are beyond home and are beyond psychosocial processes, and which kind of have a negative or a deleterious effect on children as such. So for this particular study, what had happened, what we did was that we went to 5 villages, two of which were located in the foothills of Himalayas, and 3 of them were in a state called Uttar Pradesh, the state that I come from in northern India, and it's one of the biggest states and also the most populous state in India. We conducted 4 independent focus group discussions with 32 children, and 4 focus group discussions with 33 parents in these locations. And these focus group discussions were also augmented by home-based observations to really see the degree of match and mismatch between what the parents were saying in the focus group discussion and in the observations that I kind of made in their homes as such. So there are a host of findings that we had from this study. One of the major things that we found out was that, as has been documented in literature so far, impoverished physical environment does impact children, and it impacts children in 2 ways. It impacts them directly, and it impacts them via their parents. And because there's so many deficits that the children are kind of dealing with. So if you were to shift your attention to the left side of the slide, what you would see is that I've mentioned a host of issues that kind of disrupt the normal day-to-day living of children. So it could be dealing with issues of energy poverty in terms of not having access to electricity and modern cooking fuels, issues of not having access to potable water, good sanitation condition, poor waste management, and also living in locations which had an issue with, let's say, one of the 3 villages that I visited, you tended to be flooded at least 4 times in a year, which basically meant that their activities of daily living were completely disrupted, and the parents and the children were basically living on a highway to kind of avoid being swept away in the flood as such. So these are the kind of things that the kids went through, and because there are so many issues that one is dealing with and so little protective factors, what is often proposed is a multi-domain intervention, which basically says that we just don't look at one aspect of the problem, that is that a child is dealing with, maybe parenting issues within the homes, but also the plethora of other issues that are kind of there available in the environment as such. And while doing that, what has generally been proposed in research is that it's important to find a leverage point, a point which is most amenable to change. And as you can see, a lot of issues in the physical environment are infrastructure related issues. And that kind of a change is going to take some time to come about. And parenting in that context seemed to be the most amenable to intervention and to change as such. Moving on, I mean, despite the fact that we learned a lot from this study, there were still some issues that kind of persisted. To begin with, because we had chosen to work in an already impoverished community, in the sense the average income in this community was maybe $100, $100 Australian a month. That kind of supported a family of maybe 8 children or something, or 8 or 9 children as such. So because we kind of worked in impoverished communities, we weren't sure if environment had the same impact on, like, impoverishment in the physical environment would have the same impact if the children came from a slightly advantaged economic background. Also, do parents really do something to kind of take care of the address the impoverished environment, and what is it that they do? So that was a bit of a missing piece in the puzzle. And along with the questions that we already had in the first study, we added some more questions related more to what are the things that parents and children do to kind of address adverse physical environment issues. And we conducted our second study. But before I kind of go on to the second study, I just wanted to qualify my progression from an ecological framework to an agentic framework as such. The work that I did from the second study onwards was heavily inspired by Bandura's work, social cognitive theory of agency as such. And Bandura, as you know, we lost him last year on 26th of July, and he's been such a huge influence on my PhD. I mean, sometimes when the things got a little difficult and I really couldn't put the pieces together, I would fantasize about kind of really writing things well and sending a note to him and saying that, you know what, you spoke about collective agency. This is what I've kind of done with the PhD. What do you think? But unfortunately, he left us before that. But I'm glad. I mean, I'm just so thankful for the kind of inspiration that he gave for the work as such. So when Bandura spoke about agency, he basically spoke about it being the result of a triadic interaction between three factors: the personal, the behavioral, and the environmental. So far, if you kind of look at interventions, most of the interventions tend to focus on the behavioral and the personal aspect of this interaction, and not so much on the environmental one. So from now on, the studies that I've done, like second studies or study onwards, what I did was to kind of focus on both these issues along with the environmental factor, and to see what are the disruptions that happen in the interplay between these two, between the disruption that happens between the interaction between any two factors as such. So for the second study, we progressed a little bit. We conducted 19 interviews with 35 children and 27 interviews with parents, in which the participation by mothers was 4 times that of fathers. In interviews that I conducted with both mothers and fathers, we did about 7 of those interviews. And because there's just a lot of data, what I'm going to be doing is to kind of present it in a piecemeal fashion, so that it's easy for consumption, and like we kind of get what I'm trying to say with that. So I'll be talking about personal agency first in the context of children and parents, followed by the collective agency model of a familial agency as such. So moving on to the first discussion about children's agency, one of the things that we see with the whole triadic causation model, I'll come to the model later, but just the themes that we identified based on the research. By the way, if you hear some noises in the background, it's 8 in the morning, and there are folks who are pushing vegetables on a push cart to kind of sell it to the residents here. So please enjoy the sights and sounds of India, even as I kind of talk along. So in terms of the triadic causation model of children's agency, one of the things that we understood from our findings was that despite the fact that a right-based perspective about children's agency talks about it being absolute, children's agency is largely relational in nature. So it's not as if they take all the decisions by themselves. It's heavily influenced by their significant others as such, and not always willingly, in the sense, it's not as if children wanted to be influenced by others. Parents choose to have an active role in the way children exercise their agency. Secondly, agency is exercised in very many different ways. So oftentimes when we hear a concept like agency, which is a capacity related concept, we often feel that people would be doing things for themselves. But what was interesting in this finding was that children often deliberately restricted what they wanted because they identified a resource constraint in their families as such. The other thing that we've also found in this particular study was that uh, skill building is really important for children to exercise agency. So even if the child had an inflated sense of personal efficacy, if it wasn't supported by the necessary skills, it really didn't achieve much for the child. And lastly, the milieu that the child came in from impacted the way they exercised and the kind of agency they enjoyed generally. So if we were to kind of look at the right side of the screen at the figure right now, one of the things that we can see is that I'm going to focus on the safety and mobility issue to kind of, in a way, explicate my point. So, if the child was growing up in a location where they didn't have the freedom to move around or didn't feel safe while moving around, that in a way kind of restricted the agency substantially. And in some instances, because the study was done across 4 locations, one of them was again the foothills of the Himalayas. One of the things that we found was that children sometimes had to kind of walk somewhere close to 90 minutes to get to their school and then come back from the school. And a few children dropped out because of that. And education was an important component because being educated in a way enhanced children's agency. So this is how the environment in a way kind of impinged upon children. Similarly, if there was a lot of harsh discipline or impoverishment in the environment, even if the children had the requisite behavioral skills to kind of exercise their agency, they sometimes could not because of the fear of being physically beaten up by their parents, or just in a way deliberately restricting their agency so that they didn't come across as too much or too demanding when they if they attempted to do something. Moving on to the triadic causation model of parental agency, this one is a lot cleaner than the previous one in that sense, but it pretty much looks at the same point. So if we were to kind of go back again, I forgot to mention this bit that the way we identified avenues of intervention was by marking it on a dotted line. So anywhere the interplay was disrupted between two factors, we marked it with a dotted line and in the direction where the disruption emanated. So if the disruption emanated in the environment, we kind of marked a dotted line and then we kind of identified areas which one could intervene on. But based on that, the second model that I'm presenting is a lot cleaner, but it follows the same philosophy of kind of identifying the areas of disruption and then pointing out places where we can intervene as such. So if one had to kind of look at the environmental causes here, oftentimes we kind of increase the capacities of parents or equip them with better skills to kind of address their parenting issues. But in the context that I conducted my study, some of the parents, like the mother was the primary caregiver to the child, but she was often divested of decision making capacities within her family because she was a woman. So in such context, kind of simply building her skills to kind of make decisions or to kind of solve problems does not really help, because what we're not paying attention to is the context from which she's emerging, where she's mostly divested of a lot of agency as such, just by the virtue of being a woman. Similarly, a lot of parents wanted to really give their children a good education, but if they were personally not educated, or if they had poor access to education, having just kind of completed school education, they couldn't kind of in a way carry out a lot of things that they wanted to carry out for their children as such. So these were the kind of things that we were figuring out with the parental agency. Moving on to the familial agency model, what we kind of really found out here was that familial agency is essentially the result of an interaction between the personal agency of parents and personal agency of children. And it's easy to argue, and I kind of completely support that argument, that there's just not one parent and one child in the family, and it's not just an interaction of agency between just these two parents. There's different subunits within a family, that of a father, that of a couple, as in the mother and the father, the siblings, as in the brother sisters that are there, and between the father and the child, and maybe the mother and the child, and a whole lot of other things. But for the sake of parsimony, and also because this is fairly new work, we wanted to kind of restrict it to the most basic representation. So within a family, there's the collective agency is essentially the result of the parents interacting, agency interacting with children, and their own personal agencies are impacted by a host of factors that I've kind of briefly touched upon in previous slides as such. And the interaction between parents and children's agency is facilitated by a whole lot of processes, like whether the children are able to communicate what they want, or whether parents are able to kind of effectively communicate what they want to the children. How well do the parents model desired behaviors, or vice versa, in terms of whether children are included in decision making within families or not, whether they're kind of equipped with the right problem solving skills to kind of make that impact in the decision make that contribution in the decision making process of the family or not. And the reason I've kind of put it in a dotted box was because these are the, amongst the other factors, these processes are the ones that were most amenable to change. The other factors were in a way kind of cast in stone, because I mean you can't really change the gender of, I mean you can change the gender of the parent as such, and given the whole thing about gender fluidity, but gender roles are slightly more entrenched as opposed to the processes that we are talking about here. And what happens within the family is not just the result of these interactions. There are a whole lot of other things that are happening outside the family home that also impact the collective agency of the family. It's whether the family has access to good enough both financial and non-financial resources in terms of having support system outside the family, whether they're supported by extended family and other non-formal forms of support, or and even formal form of support in terms of government freebies and things like that, the education levels of the parent and the child, and also the kind of neighborhood that they are living in. Because we were talking about familial agency, we also needed an exemplar, and also because my focus was on physical health, the physical environment that the children were growing up in. So we kind of spoke about the individual agency of the parent and the child, and the collective agency, and then we wanted to evaluate how that was in a way kind of carried out in the context of an impoverished environment. So I did content analysis for that data, and for this particular analysis, we chose 18 parent-child triads, because of the 27 interviews that were conducted with parents, 18 children, there was one mother who refused to participate along with her child. So we ended up with like around out of the 19 interviews, we ended up around with 18 interviews where both the parent and the child were present. So we did content analysis for both parent and children, and the process that I kind of followed for that was this. So let's say if the family was dealing with an issue of poor waste management in the physical environment, there were multiple perspectives and actions that the family could take. Now, inductively from the data, the three perspectives that we identify were bidirectional perspective, which basically meant that children, our parents parents also had almost a reverential or spiritual connection with the environment. They felt that what they did impacted the environment, and how the environment was in a way impacted them. Followed by a health-based perspective in which the parents were more concerned about their environment based on the kind of effect it would have on their health. And there was also a group which had a consumption-based perspective, which basically saw and the environment as a source to get something out of. So whether it was wood for the kitchen fuel, or whether it was just kind of coal in the larger context as such. So it was a very consumption-based perspective. Based on the perspective that parents and children had, they engaged in three forms of action. Either they took a preventive action, as in averting the problem of physical environment problem before it kind of occurred, or doing a corrective action in terms of doing something after the problem has occurred, or not doing any action as such. And what was also interesting within the data was whether the action was specific to the environmental concern that they had. Sometimes parents would talk about, or even children would talk about one concern, but do an action that was completely unrelated to the concern that they spoke about. So in this particular group, if we had to look at what a matched family looked like, if the issue was poor waste management, and both the parent and the child had a health-based perspective to the problem, then we gave them a match or a score of 1 for the perspective. If they took a preventive action, in that case, we gave them a score of 1 again, like a tick and a score of 1 for that thing. And if the action was also specific and they did it in the same way, we kind of again gave them a score for 1. This was a matched family. In case of a mismatched family, what would happen is that if the family was kind of facing the same issue of poor waste management, the child could have a health-based perspective to the environmental issue, and the parent could generally have a bidirectional orientation or perspective towards the physical environment. In this case, there was a mismatch between their perspectives. In terms of, and the reason it's important is because I'm going to be talking about what mismatched perspectives in families can potentially do. Then if we kind of spoke about the action, the child could potentially be taking a corrective action, but the parent could be taking a preventive action. So there was, of course, a mismatch between the kind of actions that they took. And if we were to kind of talk about the specific action that the child took, the child could possibly be looking at waste segregation, whereas the parents could generally be planting trees, which is not really related to, like not directly related to poor waste management, or in a way kind of reducing plastic use as such. So this was like a mismatched family, but it's easy to understand that families didn't fall into two neat categories of matched and mismatched. There was usually they usually existed along a continuum where there was a complete mismatch to their everything matching in a family as such. And so the parent and the child could have mismatched perspective, but probably be doing the same action and the same specific action. So there's quite a bit of variety in terms of how the data was categorized based on this. Now, based on the information that we gathered from the familial action for addressing impoverished environmental conditions, one of the things that we looked at, one of the things that I did was to map on the findings to the core properties of agency. Now, Bandera kind of spoke about 3 properties that aided in exercising agency. The first one is forethought. So one needs to kind of have some thought or some plan of action or some goal in terms of what they're working towards. When they kind of have that goal, what parents and children, or rather families in general, did was to kind of direct their actions in the service of that goal. And lastly, they kind of in a way reflected on the value of the action, in the sense what they were doing was, I mean, was it worth the effort or not? And then depending on the evaluation of the value of their personal and collective actions, they would either continue with the action or discontinue with it. Now, if it's seen in the context of the findings and the implications of the findings, what I've done in this slide and the next 2 slides to follow is to kind of put the findings in the top box and the implications of those findings in the box in the at the base. So the thing that we see is that of the 18 families that we kind of the data from 18 families that we analyzed, 45% families had mismatched perspective. And one would intuitively think that having a mismatched perspective was a bad thing. In reality, it really wasn't, because it afforded a lot of opportunity for crosstalk. But what became problematic was that if it wasn't aided with the right communication skills, so let's say if the child had a bidirectional perspective and the parent had a consumption-based perspective, if the child was not able to communicate their concerns to the parents effectively, then it became a problem. Or if the parents in a way kind of overpowered children, even if when they were trying to communicate their concerns, then it kind of became a problem. Also, the kind of perspectives that family had, both individually and collectively, in a way shaped their beliefs in efficacy. There are no prizes for guessing that parents and parents, children, families with let's say consumption-based perspective didn't really feel that they could do anything about the environment. On the other hand, you had the eco warriors who had bidirectional perspective and who felt that they could change the world. And then I got these really quotable quotes in the interview where they would say every drop counts, and I was like, yeah, it does. I mean, so that's how it kind of in a way impacted their efficacy as such. Also, if people had high degree of influence, a high degree of perceived influence or a belief in their efficacy, they also kind of one would expect that they would kind of act on it more consistently, but that's something that I'll kind of talk about later. But nearly 44 of the people that we interviewed, 44% families did have had high degree of perceived influence. The rest of them either had moderate or low levels of perceived influence. The other thing that was of concern and interest to us was the source of environmental awareness within these families. So across the board in all the 18 families, the children learned about environment, about the physical environment in their schools, and the parents learned it either based on their discussions with friends or through their personal reading. Now, the interesting thing about getting information about environmental awareness from the schools is this, that uh, the focus of environmental education in different places was very diverse. So for example, in the hills and in the rural areas, the focus was more local. So people were more concerned about, in a way, kind of having pine trees in the villages in the foothills of Himalayas, and they said that that's not good for our environment. We need trees which have broad-based leaves. So they kind of started planting their own trees accordingly. But then there were also kids in the urban and the peri-urban area who spoke about tectonic shifts and earthquakes and uh, fires in the west coast of America. But when I kind of inquired about the actual physical environment issues that they were facing, they would kind of draw a blank, despite the fact that these interviews were conducted in the city called Lucknow, where I live. And they are like, we have the worst air quality index in the country as such. So they really weren't aware in that sense. Also, oftentimes there was a poor intergenerational transfer of knowledge for reasons that I've kind of alluded to initially in terms of issues with communication and things like that. And even of the 45% of families that were highly aware, it did not necessarily translate into an action for them. Now, when we kind of look at what can be done with this finding, is that it's important to kind of not start patting ourselves on the back if we kind of teach people or give them environmental awareness, because we realize that acquisition of knowledge does not necessarily mean that they'll do something about it. Also, it's very difficult for people to kind of engage in an action unless they cannot, unless they are able to kind of link their present actions to the future circumstances as such, and in a way kind of project into the future and see what difference it's going to make if they stop doing this particular negative thing or engaging in a particular risk behavior, like cutting trees for wood fuel and things like that. And also identify avenues for intergenerational learning, because people were getting information from such diverse sources that if we did not facilitate crosstalk within the families, it was difficult to kind of have them move forward, even if the child was really aware as such. Now, moving on to the second aspect, if you kind of look at the kind of action that families undertook in the service of a better physical environment, the perspective that was most likely to guide action is no surprises with the health perspective. So if the families felt that their health was being negatively impacted because of the environment, they felt the need to do something about it. 72.2% of these families did engage in deliberate environmental action, and out of these 72.2% families, nearly two-thirds of these families, there was a similarity between the action that the parents and the children engaged in. But what is a little concerning here is that not all the action that families took was specific to the concern that they had. And I've kind of already spoken about the lack of synchrony between the concern that families had and the action that they kind of took for it. Also, if parents were not really suitably involved with the children while they were taking an action, there was a fair chance that that action would not be continued well into the future. So the implication in terms of intervention is that we need to help families to kind of, in a way, develop a norm of environmental action, in the sense have a moral standard within the family in terms of what environmental action would kind of look like for them. Also, children can influence the standards of environmental action within the families, and this they can do through nudges. But to kind of put the complete onus of environmental action on the children was not only misplaced, I mean, the thought was a little misplaced, it's not even effective in the long term. Lastly, in terms of moving on to the sustenance of actions, if the families kind of undertook these actions, there was one of the things that came across very strongly was a huge disengagement with their responsibility towards the environment. So a lot of families would be like, you know what, we do things, but we do it occasionally. We can't do it consistently, because you've got to realize that the environment is not just our problem, it's a problem at large. So if others are not doing it, how much can we do? But amongst that group of 18 families, there were 4 parents who felt that their children would in a way kind of carry their work forward and become real agents of change as far as environmental action is concerned. And what was specific to these families was that environmental issues were like dinner time conversations for them. They did speak about environment, as opposed to other families where it really didn't qualify as a dinner table conversation. Also, in terms of the parents, they were more receptive to the kind of information that the kids kind of brought in. So in terms of the intervention that is being designed, one needs to be able to kind of think of interventions that have personal and personal and tangible benefits for the families, for them to be able to engage in. And also, when we're kind of training one family to engage in the right kind of environmental action, we also need to equip them with the skills to get others on board. Otherwise, it just feels like a very lonely fight for them. So we had a good enough understanding of what individual agencies look like and what a collective agency would look like. And the next step was to kind of adapt an intervention and trial that out. But before that, we just realized that we didn't really have a scale that would measure that. Now, familial agency is like a fairly novel concept, so we didn't have too many studies that kind of measured agency of the family at the collective level as such. So the first thing we needed was an outcome measure, and we also needed it in a language that I was doing the research in, which is Hindi and English as such. So we developed a bipartite. That means the scale had 2 parts: a parent subscale and a child subscale, and we developed it in 2 languages, Hindi and English, using a 3-step systematic process of item development, and scale evaluation. For the item development process, we, based on the studies that we had conducted so far, and also the theory that my favorite Bandra had kind of so generously provided through his prolific research career, we had enough material to kind of come up with 107 items for the parent subscale and 100 items for the child subscale. And Alina and Eric from PFSC, and other 8 people from other centers at UQ were kind of sent to evaluate the scale. And my apologies now, because now when I kind of look at Alina, the number of items we send, that I'm like, how did anybody get through that, and how did people not throw the scale back at me? But I was in India, so obviously I'm saved by distance. But I mean, I completely acknowledge the effort that people put in here. After we kind of got the items back from the expert review, we had made an a priori decision that the items that were evaluated on readability and the value of the items, as in the whether there was some value to the content of the items. If the items got a score of less than 8 on 10, we in a way did away with those items. So after that decision, we were left with 94 items for parents and 90 items for children, which, based on the qualitative feedback, came down further to 78 items for parents and 76 items for children. Those items were again taken to the community, and I kind of tested it with families in the community, and the number further came down to 66 items for parents and 65 items for children. I'll be talking about exploratory factor analysis and the confirmatory factor analysis in the next couple of slides. So with the exploratory factor analysis, with 66 items for parents and 65 items for children, we administered that scale to 302 diets consisting of 1 parent and 1 child. And though the scale was initially administered in Hindi and English both, but I was facing difficulty in terms of finding families where both the people, as in the parent and the child, spoke and understood English at the same level. So we ended up doing exploratory factor analysis with the Hindi scale as such, and got a 5-factor model based on the exploratory factor analysis. This 5-factor model was again tested for dimensionality during the confirmatory factor analysis, where we got a slightly more diverse demographic profile with parents who spoke both Hindi and English, and also children who spoke both Hindi and English. And one of the things that I want to point out at this point in time is that English is really not our first language. Like I come from North India, so I speak Hindi along with English. So sometimes knowing English also in a way kind of demarcates or in a way decides the kind of socioeconomic group that you come from. So there's very little chance that you would walk to a daily wage labor and have him speak to you in English. So when I say that we did it in Hindi and we did the administration both in Hindi and English, we really managed to kind of capture a wide group of people. And based on this administration, we ended up with a two-factor correlational model where there were 7 items for personal efficacy and 6 items for familial efficacy. What was a surprise for us was environmental action not really making it to the group, but a little bit of analysis just helped us to understand that the word environment was perceived in different ways by different people. So I guess that's the reason it really didn't kind of meet the test of dimensionality that we looked at. Here's the scale that we kind of came up with. So as you can see that 7 items mirror each other completely in, as far as the personal efficacy scale is concerned, but in familial efficacy, there's 1 item each that is specific to the parent scale and to the child subscale as such. In terms of the internal consistency, we got a fairly good score for both the subscales, and both the subscales kind of have a large and positive correlation. We also did try to test for the concurrent validity, in which we were slightly at a disadvantage because there was nothing to kind of measure the collective efficacy as such, but we managed to do, in a way, kind of do the concurrent validity for the general self-efficacy and the parent and the personal self-efficacy, and the results look fairly promising to me in that sense. All right, so we had the theory, we had the scale, and we were all set to kind of trial out the intervention. But just before I kind of leap in and talk about that, I wanted to talk about why I felt that there was a need to activate familial agency to address physical environmental issues. So Patton and his colleagues in Australia had kind of come up with this really wonderful concept of triple dividend. I felt that if we kind of worked with both parents and children, we were basically putting forth the concept of triple dividend plus 1 in the case of physical environment, which basically meant that not only are we kind of impacting the child currently, but as a future adult and as a future parent, and we're also in a way benefiting the parents as such. And the reason I felt that we needed to activate familial agency through the use of parenting interventions was because I felt that parents and children kind of in a way share an environment, and a degraded environment is an unfortunate legacy that we are leaving for the next generation as such. And also the ethics of abrogation of adult personal responsibility to children, and saying that, I mean, much as we laud Greta Thunberg, it kind of also reflects very poorly on us as adults for doing such a bad job at managing an environment that a child, not a child anymore, but like somebody much younger than us has to take on the responsibility. Also, the intergenerational benefits of doing such kind of work, like it doesn't just stay restricted to the child, but is kind of spans the whole gamut from the parent to the child, and then the future children that are to come. And for this, I felt that there was a need to kind of expand the ambit of traditional parenting interventions. So far, we kind of focus on the green ellipse, which is just the home. But I feel we need to kind of expand it a little bit to also focus on the environment that the parents are living in, so that the results that we get out of it are not just specific to positive outcomes for children and parents, but the environment in general as such. All right. So while I was kind of thinking about the intervention study and things like that, I work a lot with images, and I use the Hindi word tirpal, which I am not too sure if I get the English pronunciation right, but it's toppling. So it's like the big thing that people use to kind of cover themselves up to kind of in a way prevent rainwater from coming in. And often in the communities that I visited in the villages, both in Uttar Pradesh and in the foothills of Himalayas, I would see people use that toppling or tirpal to kind of cover their thatched roofs and things like that. And also because in my head, parents are pretty much like the tirpal or the canopy that we have on top of our head to kind of prevent any really bad thing from happening to us. So I did some bit of forced wordplay, and I realized that the acronym does not go along with the complete thing, but please just indulge me for a moment and believe that tirpal does kind of rhyme or go well with triple P for sustainable development. What we did for the proposed intervention, which I kind of wrote out in the almost 2 years back in 2020, was to kind of add a module to the already existing Triple P discussion group. And the way it was devised was that the session one goes the way it's planned in the Triple P manual as such. The only differences that I made was that in the manual, we kind of spoke about, in that particular module, we kind of speak about interesting environments. I had to kind of change it to safe and healthy environments. In terms of negative talk, I kind of changed it to self-compassion and mindfulness and things like that, just to kind of make it more culturally appropriate, but not too much of tinkering around with the original module there. But I added another session, which was a session 2, which was focused completely on the physical environment. And in that second session, there were two parts to it. So there was a concurrent parent and child session where both parents and children received age appropriate information regarding the environment separately, and then they kind of came together and made like a smart environmental goal for themselves, which was in line with the specific concern that they had pointed out as such. And what was planned at that point in time was that we would have 3 points, time points for evaluation and things like that. But then the world as we know it changed in 2020 March, so the intervention never really saw the light of the day. And that's where I would kind of like to kind of end the presentation, because I mean the original PhD was planned as an more from an implementation science perspective, but it ended up being more of a meta theoretical contribution to collective agency as such. And one of the things that guides me in this work is what Albert Bandura said about our responsibility, our collective responsibility to make the world a better place for children. And with this, we come to an absolute end of the presentation. Thank you so much for listening to me and maybe putting up with a gravy thick Indian accent, but thank you so much for that.